is, I don't want my kids to grow up in a community that doesn't have an orchestra. Do they go to these concerts? No, they don't. But the orchestra represents something. And I think what it represents in this case is a kind of view of something better than everyday life, something that exists for its own sake, for, in a sense, a higher purpose, and it's good to have that around.
Well, you know, there are things in Milwaukee that I don't go to. I mean, I've never been to a hockey game, but I'm glad there's a hockey team in town, and not just because it's good for business. I think it's an important resource to have.
Well, a lot of people like hockey, and also it's a mark of a first-rate town.
Right.
Mark of a first-rate town. Right. So now it occurs to me to ask you, because you have so many strings to your bow, so many things you do, to take some issue that faces orchestras and ask you how it plays out from the point of view of you as a union official, you as an ASOL board member, and then you simply as the leader of the viola section. What issue should we take?
I've got a perfect one. You probably know that last October we became the first American orchestra to put archival material up for sale on the internet.
Yes.
We went live on iTunes October 3rd, 4th, somewhere around there. And it was all material from a radio broadcast. It was nothing that had been released commercially. Well, that actually was a real interesting confluence for me of my various roles, because first of all, that was a result of a labor agreement that I had helped write back in 2000 that ICSOM and the Federation, and to a lesser extent the smaller orchestras and the major managers, had negotiated, the Internet agreement. And it kind of sat there on the shelf. Nobody had used it. So I had a role in doing that, and I'd learned an awful lot about why it was important and how to do it.
Parenthetically here, for people who may not know, what did this agreement change? What did it say?
Well, basically there was no agreement to cover material being put on the Internet. And at the time, in 2000, there was
recorded material.
Well, or even live material.
Or live material. Right. But the point is, recordings of the musical performances that the musicians need to be able to control the income from.
That we call electronic media product.
Right.
And the musicians had always been paid for that, in whether it had been radio or television, or, most important, of recordings. You know, what we used to call phono. In fact, the name of the recording, still for those of us that have been around for a long time, the CD agreement we refer to as phono labor, because we spent so many decades referring to it as phono labor, and now it's something else, and I can never remember what it is. But there was no way to put stuff on the Internet and have people paid for it. And the Federation was getting a lot of interest from orchestras, who were getting a lot of interest from outside funders, and to some extent from board people saying, why aren't we on the Internet? And there were various venture capitalists running around with some very off-the-wall schemes, which we heard most of. None of which, I think, except maybe for Andante, came to any kind of fruition.
These are schemes to set up companies that would market this stuff on the Internet.
Yes, and there was one guy who wanted to put cameras in all the halls and tape, film all the concerts live and put them on the Internet video.
And Andante.com, which was a very, very ambitious site, which did stream, I guess, Vienna Philharmonic and Philadelphia Orchestra.
Philly was actually the first American orchestra to use the Internet agreement at all.
But the problem with this was Andante did not have much income, and so eventually they
I think there was another problem, too, which was deeper, which was that streaming fit the technology at the time because of bandwidth limitations. But as soon as people got bandwidth, what they wanted to do was own material.
Right.
And they wanted to own high-quality material, which is hard to do streaming. You can, but
right. So, you mean people, consumers, listeners, absolutely.
Right.
So, now, getting back to, you were involved in negotiating the Internet agreement that made this possible.
Right. And then we had a internal media summit in the orchestra, which I was basically just invited as president of the local and somebody that knew media. We were talking about, actually not Internet, more recordings after we'd done our Hansel and Gretel, which was a lovely recording, which hasn't sold very many copies. But
this was a regular CD release?
It was actually a CD of a radio performance we did for World of Opera, for NPR.
Yeah.
And we turned it into actually, it was the first recording of Hansel and Gretel in English for decades. Beautiful recording. It really came out well. It hasn't sold, but maybe it will. And we were looking for other things to do, and one of our artistic advisor at the time brought in that another one of his clients was looking for material to put on the internet because they had an arrangement with iTunes, and my ears pricked up and said, "Oh, we could do that." And again, because I'd spent so long as part of negotiating this contract and learning about the various possibilities, I was more clued in probably than anybody in the room could have been because they hadn't spent that time. So I got everybody excited about it, which wasn't hard because nobody had done it. We really would have been the first. And not only was it worth doing, but it's for an orchestra like mine, it's definitely worth doing something big for the first time because you get press and recognition and image that you can't get any other way. So we pushed through this all. I was functioning partly as union president, partly as representative internally of the musicians because we had an elected media committee, partly artistically because we had to pass on all these recordings. Part of the deal was that everybody approve all the recordings so that the musicians had complete approval, which we don't have with radio, we don't have with CDs. This was really one of the interesting things about the Internet agreement was the degree of control it pushed down to the local level and how open it was. Basically, every aspect of the deal had to be agreed to locally. Compensation, repertoire, even the choice of distributor, had to be approved by the musicians. It was like it was maybe the first time in my orchestra we'd ever done anything truly collaborative that actually resulted in something. I mean, truly collaborative, not just management making the decisions and musicians maybe participating or saying yes or no to some aspects.
One thing that really stands out for me as you recount this is the thought that musicians would have to approve the way that the recordings be distributed.
Yep.
Because normally, obviously, that wouldn't happen.
Right.
Management makes a recording, and usually then the record company decides who distributes it.
Oh, yeah. Well,
so how did it happen that management was willing to allow the musicians to have, in effect, a veto power here? Because being devil's advocate or worst case scenarioizing, I say the musicians get unreasonable. The musicians refuse to agree to some method of distribution because they have grandiose ideas that it should be better. So why did management agree?
Well, on the local level, they agreed because they didn't have any choice. Because although I think they might have anyway, but that's the way the agreement is written, the Internet agreement. Mm-hmm. On the national level, it was in part a reaction on both musicians and management's part to the fact that we had been doing recordings for 50 years and had seen very little benefit from it aside from whatever money it brought in. I mean, it was a classic story of, and I think it might have been Philly, it might have been some other orchestra that went to Europe, and there were no recordings on sale on the lobby, even though they just made a bunch for their big record company. And they complained to the management complained to the record company, and they went back next year, and they went out in the lobby, and there were lots of recordings by the London Symphony Orchestra on sale of the repertoire they were doing. The record company didn't care if the orchestra benefited from those recordings. And there was a feeling on both sides that we had essentially bartered away our artistic inheritance and our artistic history for, what's the biblical saying?
A mess of pottage.
A mess of pottage, thank you, exactly.
Phrase.
And had gotten very little. So with the Internet agreement, one of the things we tried to do was really favor self-produced recordings that were owned by the owned and controlled by the institution.
Okay, now one backward step we better take here because I myself am not really clear on it. A national agreement to which the AF&M is one party, who negotiates that with the AF&M? Who is the management that signs off?
The management, in a sense, it's an ad hoc group. It's a multi-employer group that forms for the purpose of negotiating a multi-employer agreement. In practice, there's a group of 40 or 50 orchestras that band together. They have a media committee. They elect a chair. They send people. It's not always the same group to every agreement. But I think there were some 65 signatory orchestras.